Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight two colleagues from my days gone by, Chris and Lee, who are here tonight actually in service of the foundation established by Dr. Gregorian to render care to needy people overseas, particularly in regards to surgical equipment and training. And so, Lee, you can be the nurse person, since you're one, about talking about the plan to bring nurses over to train. And Chris, you're an expert on equipment. Mm-hmm. And so maybe I'll start with you, Chris. What are the plans for the foundation in the future?
Well, I guess to give a background from perspective of a business owner and a vendor that's worked in the medical field for years, Dr. Gregorian reached out and said, hey, especially when the war with Armenia and Azerbaijan started, he goes, Chris, can we get some equipment donated to help out with this? I'm like, oh, absolutely. Let me reach out to the different companies that I know and friends and see what we can come up with. And it was remarkable. So many companies just donated equipment, and Dr. Gregorian was able to take it over there and perform surgical procedures with equipment and then leave it to help with the casualties from the war and people that were in need. That one we had a little bit of time to get things ready. Yes. When the war in Ukraine and Russia started, we didn't have a lot of time. And so it was so stressful. Literally, the day that he was flying out, I went to FedEx and picked everything up in a pickup truck and took it to the hospital to meet. It was that close.
Yes.
The night before, I was like, Lord, please let all this equipment come in.
Yes.
And it was stressful, And these companies, I have to really, thank them for the help. Zivation helped out, SpineWave helped.
Yes.
Spinology, C-Spine, all these companies just gave an abundance of equipment to help out with the war.
Did you ask for a particular thing, or they just said whatever you feel like you can give us?
Yeah, it's like we're going in to provide support for people suffering casualties during the war or whoever needs it. And so, but we receive pedicle screws and cervical plates and cages and instruments and it was humbling, wouldn't you say, Lee? It was humbling the amount of equipment that these companies donated. They were very kind to offer that up. So literally picked it up at FedEx, drove to the office, right, Lee? And we loaded it all in suitcases right there in the office and threw it in the car and sent them off to the airport. And literally as we're sitting there and we're loading this up, I said, Dr. Gregorian, I was like, I think we ought to look at this and how can we do this in a more organized fashion? And I said, what you're trying to do is remarkable. Yes. And you've been doing it over the years. And how can we continue this in a way that really, it makes sense? And so I think we ought to set up a nonprofit. And so he left and was contacting us throughout the trip. So he goes, let's talk about this when I get back. And that was how it all started. And it's really been a roller coaster ride, wouldn't you say, Lee? Because we know absolutely nothing about this.
Right. Yes.
And so one of the big things, and we're really excited about, yesterday we got approval for our 501c3 status. And it's very stressful. That's the basically that we're operating as a nonprofit, so people can donate equipment and instruments and all these things, as a tax deduction.
Yeah. Have you considered? It seems to me one of the issues is transportation, and you mentioned FedEx. Is it possible to talk to FedEx about, or a carrier? Maybe they've got some extra room on one of their planes. They would consent to do something like that. I'm not sure how that works, but that might be something to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know when Dr. Gregorian flew last time, it was, how many suitcases was it?
6 or 7.
6 or 7. And they weren't small suitcases.
Right. It would seem that one of the limiting factors are the transportation issues. If the contacts can be obtained, and then there are a lot of, or at least a number of nonprofits that might give you some guidance or some help in doing that. Well, that's great. And so your plans on the future, let's see, it's February and there should be a lot of casualties coming soon. The big, massive Russian offensive
Right.
is supposed to be taking place in the east. Big casualties coming, and maybe that's one of the things to be thinking about. And not only that, all the civilian casualties that are happening with these Russian missile attacks.
Sure.
And looking at the need of the civilian population for traumatic injuries. Any comments about that? So the idea is, what is it that a nation at war would need, and with lots of casualties taking place, plus their civilian arrangements have become disjointed with everything happening. Do you have any plans for that, as to how you're going to?
The interesting, and Dr. Gregorian mentioned it in the prior session, the very last conversation was, okay, what can we do to help? What do you need?
Yes.
Do you need surgical support? Do you need training? Do you need implants, instruments? And the overwhelming reply was, we need training for our nursing staff.
That's a good segue into our nurse here. Now, Lee, don't be shy.
Okay.
Just get out there and say this, what the situation is, and that is, it seems to be a great idea to me, but train some nurses. They're really, or any mid-level care providers. That's a crucial thing, and I think it's often neglected and so important. I've heard of doctors coming here, doctors there, train some doctors. I've rarely heard about other healthcare personnel getting exposure to Western training that could be in sync with trying to make appropriate use of this high-tech equipment.
Correct.
What are your thoughts about that, Lee?
Well, to kind of go back a little, when all of these missions were getting started, there was a lot of desire, not only from Dr. Gregorian, but a lot of our colleagues to help in these times of crisis, but we were very limited. Doctors Without Borders, all these other organizations, they don't really allow us to be able to provide the support where we specialize in, which happens to be neurosurgery for us three, but surgery in general tends to kind of lack. And so being able to provide for that to this particular mission has been really cool to see. Chris was talking about getting our supplies, our equipment, things like this. One of the things that we discussed while we're frantically packing these suitcases to get Dr. Gregorian going is, how great would it be if we just had a stockpile to go to?
Yes.
To be able to pull for these quick moments of, hey, we need to get going, we need to serve, and to be able to resource that would be amazing. From my understanding, the doctors in the other countries did provide lists of things that they needed, and so Dr. Gregorian was able to provide that in his 6, 7, 8 suitcases that he took internationally. But with this last trip especially, he was discussing, well, what can we bring now that the supply chains have been reestablished, now that we're getting, you guys are getting what you need, how else are we able to help you? And with his most recent trip to Ukraine, it was more just the training of the ICU nurses. And so what we're hoping to do with our foundation is be able to support anywhere from 4 to 6 nurses over a 6-month period to come over to our hospital. We got some wonderful nurses who are willing to translate for us and just kind of,
that's an important thing.
It's very important.
Yes.
And be able to support them as they learn, things that we might take for granted, such as bedside nursing, how to maintain an EVD, all of these different things that we're doing that they just need help with. And so being able to do that, I think will be great, because in turn we can return them to Ukraine, and then they can go and teach, and it can just continue to spread.
It seems to be a great idea. I like that idea. And right now, you mentioned the reestablishment of the supply chain. So presumably there's someone in the health ministry in Kiev who says, well, next month we need, this big Russian onslaught's about to take place. So we're going to need 28,000 tons of this, or 7,000 tons of this or that, or this or that. And so the government might well be, I don't know if they are or not, but it would be reasonable if they did that. They might be searching to get all these resources put in place as well as they can. And however, I feel confident that they haven't considered the role of mid-level providers and nurses in this catastrophe the country faces. And it seems to be they'd really try and do something, and I think that would resonate. That would be a very nice idea. It would require it, and it might not be as difficult as you imagine. I don't know, but I mean, it does seem, when you've mentioned it to people, it seems to be very enthusiastically received. Is that right?
Yeah, well, as a physician assistant, one of the things to tell you about my career is we came from the battle lines. Our particular career came from paramedics out on the front fields who were tending to the wounded soldiers. And then after the wars, really had this wealth of information, wealth of medical knowledge, wealth of skill sets that they weren't able to utilize. And so slowly but surely, the way for advanced practice professionals were able to be established. And so now you're almost in the same setting. Here you are with these medics that are out there treating, and being able to work under the mindset of a doctor, and being able to treat and being able to provide the medical needs at that moment. And then you have your nurses who are also out there on the front lines taking care. And so really this is so much of where we came from, these two particular careers, already kind of just in motion yet again in today's world.
Yes.
For sure.
It's very interesting.
The casualties are pretty extreme. I mean, trying to think about the numbers, maybe 100,000 Ukrainians killed, some number like that, thousands of civilian casualties. And Dr. Gregorian showed pictures of hospitals being overwhelmed, and all the migration of people from the east. It must be a pretty chaotic situation. And finding government officials that would be helpful if they would go along with that.
That's a fantastic point. I think one of the issues that we're going to have to address, particularly in Ukraine, is when the war ends, hopefully, cooler minds prevail and we're able to bring this war to an end quickly. But all of the besides just the casualties that we have now, they're going to have to rebuild the infrastructure, particularly on the east side of Ukraine, and that's where I think a lot of what we're doing could come in play. We want to go in, and this is how we've tried to structure how we approach these missions. Is we'll go in, assess the situation, because some foundations will want to go in and provide surgical support, and that's great.
Yes.
But what we want to do is we want to get these facilities in a very targeted approach up and functional on their own.
Yes.
Where they have, whether it's the surgeon support, the mid-level support, nursing support, equipment, training, whatever we need to do.
Yes.
And so, and when we're looking at Ukraine, let's say we're going to the, let's say Donbass region, for example. There's a hospital there that's in dire need of equipment and rebuilding that hospital back up. And that's what we want to do. We want to go in and assess the situation. Our specialty right now is neurosurgical. That's the resources that we have.
Yes.
And there's a funny thing. We went back and forth for weeks about what are we going to name this foundation. Is it going to be Worldwide Neurosurgical Missions, Worldwide Surgical Missions? And we went back and forth forever about it. And we decided we want to make it, our specialty is neurosurgical. That's what we do.
Right, yes.
But what if somebody comes in and they want OBGYN or a neurology all these different specialties? There's the same need for all these other specialties. But our approach is, let's go in, assess the situation, figure out what we need to do, come back, get the resources, put the infrastructure in place, and then see what we can do to help out.
Yes.
Which is actually what we're doing right now with our other project in Ethiopia. We're hoping to plan for a future missions trip back there, now having talked to them about what their infrastructure needs, especially with like their OR, their ICU, just the different things that they require to get back up to speed. So we're hoping to go there and be able to do exactly what Chris is saying, be able to help them establish that.
Yes. Well, that's there's a lot of need, obviously, in the world. If you 8 billion people there, I don't know how many people live in straitened circumstances, 7 billion people everywhere. So transmission of technology to other countries is really a big possibility. One can say that. Also, there's a big book about the Eastern Europe called The Bloodlands, and so the story is it's repetitive trouble, and so the trouble may not. It may linger a long time.
I suspect so. Yeah. I read that, a similar book.
Yeah, and it may take some bad turns. I think hospitals have been attacked. Lots of tragedies, lots of terrible things happen, and so the situation is evolving a lot. I'll ask this question: would it in this rather chaotic situation? Is it easier to do something in Ethiopia, where there's a war there too?
For sure.
There's a terrible war to the north, but big parts of the country are, shall we say, stable within limits. I mean, would it be easier to do something there, or do you ever thought about where you should devote your resources?
This is I think everybody that wants to give, that wants to help out. You look at the world and it's like there's pure chaos right now. It's like, where do you even start, right?
Yes.
I mean, for example, Turkey. I mean, look at the earthquake that they had yesterday. The amount of casualties coming out of this is going to be awful. So you look at all these different situations throughout the world, and you're like, what do you do? What can you do? And you know what? He's like, what has God gifted me with, and what can I do to help out with?
Yes.
And He's given us specifically abilities to go out and help in ways that we can't. We can't help everybody out, but what can we do? We can go into this particular hospital, assess this situation, and see what we can do to help, whether it's surgical support, equipment, whatever that is. And so I think you make a good point, because Ukraine is going to be an ongoing issue. This isn't going away anytime soon, I don't think. But how can we help these people out individually? How can we go and assess one situation and try to help out with that?
Yes.
And whether that's Ethiopia, Ukraine, who knows, we might be in Turkey and a couple of weeks from us. You don't ever know.
There's so many places in the world that are unstable and people are suffering. You could just go around anywhere almost and say this situation is not an optimal one. And you mentioned Turkey and the earthquake. Just south of there is Syria. So the Syrians, the population of the place has been decimated. It was about 21 million, but back before everything started. Now it's a third of that, 7 million people, and it's cold, and everyone is just in a terrible situation. And many parts of the world are quite neglected. So you could say Pakistan. I mean, you could go anywhere you wanted to, and just many places are in terrible shape. Well, it's a really commendable thing, and taking these steps are great. And I think one of the big things might be to establish some knowledge of how one does this. I mean, how do you do this just starting out de novo? That's can be a vexing, difficult thing, and the fact you're taking these steps is really commendable. And so do you need a warehouse? Is that what you need to you mentioned that? Or
yes.
Hopefully we get to that point. Right now we're sort of taking a very targeted approach, because the fact of the matter is we have the resources that we the three of us are using to build the foundation. So there's not I think we had $300 in that account the other day.
Well, that's good.
I laugh, but it's just like all things. It does require resources to get it in place, and that's one of the things that we'll have to work towards, is raising funds and to get this set up. So. Well, but interestingly, you can see one of the postcards that we set up. This actually has a QR code. If you scan it, it'll take you to our PayPal donation.
Well, that's a good hint for our audience to consider that. Well, the story is, let's see, it's February. Dr. Gregorian can't travel back and forth forever. I mean, have you thought of some way to establish a nexus between these different countries that might not require his on-the-ground presence. Maybe that's a useful thing to consider. Mm-hmm. And particularly with nurses, I'm going to go back to Lee in regards to that. So I bet you could get 20 nurses pretty easily to do this. I mean, some number like that. Hospitals could, if you had some translators. I don't know if it's so common to speak English, maybe, but that would be a limiting factor, wouldn't it? Do you have some people that might translate? I know Ukrainian is possible. How about one of the 18 dialects of the Ethiopian people?
We haven't quite gotten there yet.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
But talking about Ukraine, our goal is to have at least one nurse who can speak English fairly fluently.
Yes.
Have that nurse stay the actual whole period of time that we rotate other nurses through,
yes,
in hopes that they're able to at least get oriented and stay oriented and be able to help with the other nurses who are coming in for anywhere from 2 to 4 week periods, help get them situated, start translating, being able to, again, just kind of really stack up on the knowledge.
Yes.
And then when they go back, like that almost be your lead nurse, so
right,
that you can at least be able to have at least one person who is able to stay the whole length of time and really, really lock down what they needed
yes,
to know.
Well, one observation I'll make is often the idea is Western elite medicine or care, and that the other people from other situations don't have anything to contribute. They actually do. So you can really maybe get some insight into some things that you haven't thought about, particularly how people get by with less. Mm-hmm. So I think the American healthcare system has its troubles, and are there things we might be able to pick up or learn that things are mm-hmm. being done more efficiently just because they have to be.
I think that's very
right.
important. I think you're spot on.
Yes. So that would be and also I think the idea of, I think it's important to just say we're fellow humans here, and we just, our life circumstances have put us in this position, but there's no reason for us to feel particularly superior about it. And
right.
You guys have been through more than we have, and we can learn a lot from
mm-hmm.
your. Well, one thing might be your response to suffering, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I'm sure many people are very, very nobly born this. And maybe that's a moral lesson that would be useful mm-hmm. in our sort of swollen world that we have here. Maybe people that really, this is what our situation is, and this is how I've endured it, and terrible losses of loved ones. I would think many people have been terribly injured.
Let me share an interesting story with you, and it's really impacted me a lot. And Lee and I visited a Ukrainian church north of Atlanta. Was it last week before?
2 weeks ago.
And we sat down with the pastor and talked with him, and just a humbling man. And he told me that he got involved in Ukraine, particularly with missions, with training different pastors that would go over there.
Yes.
Particularly in the military and in the police forces. And they've trained a lot of different people in that, and it's been amazing. But one of the interesting stories he told us was they've got these little MP3 players. And
what's that?
It's like a little audio player, like a cassette player, but it's. I
think I know what that is. I'll imagine it. Yes.
So it has the gospel on it in Ukrainian and Russian. Okay.
Yes.
And they were sending these out, thousands of them.
Yes.
Okay. And what they found was, even in the tragedy, you would have Ukrainian soldiers that would be captured or killed. The Russians would have these. They would confiscate these players. Well, the gospel was being spread.
Yes.
Not just in Ukraine, but in Russia, and even in spite of the war and how awful that was. To hear that pastor talk about that, it was really a humbling experience to hear him talk about that. Even in that death and how awful that was, that even the Russian soldiers were being impacted by that.
I mentioned the notion of a civil war. I mean, and often when brothers fight, that's one of the more violent things that happen. But there are also Christian communities, And my experience in Russia, I can well remember when the Soviet Union cracked up in the streets of Moscow. A young man just started to read out of the Bible, just did it on the big street there, and around him several hundred people dropped to their knees. I mean, what I want to say is there's a large religious component to the Russian people, and I know, for instance, in Macon, many Bibles have been sent over to in many places in Russia, and there's a pretty strong Christian undercurrent there, and I'd say the same in the Ukraine. And I don't know how one gets peace out of that, but that might be one of the things. I mean, it's sort of an out there thing. But what do you do when brothers, and we could say Christian brothers, try and kill each other? And often they're being led by Pied Pipers, a corrupted state, which is a big problem, isn't it? Additionally, I think one thing to say is that Ukraine is not without any, as all of us are, not without sin, and so there are big scandals recently. There's corruption. There's this. There's that. And just being full of rectitude there, I think is a really nice thing to be. I mean, I think people might well expect corrupt behavior. They've certainly observed a lot of it, and so not doing that, I think, would be a really good thing. And just sort of seeing what could be done to reflect on this terrible tragedy. So one thing to just say is, the wisdom that comes out of such experiences is often a two-way street. And say, for instance, going to Ethiopia, all right, there are 120 million people there, they've got a terrible war, they've had this history almost no one knows anything about. There's a huge amount of suffering. What does that mean? And for our species, as far as that goes, is that a big problem? We are all in this shrinking world with these terrible tragedies, ongoing tragedies everywhere. Just making a gesture to try and relieve some of the suffering, I think, is quite a noble calling, if I can say that.
Yeah.
Well, do you plan a trip there to the Ukraine or Ethiopia? Any plans? You want to take some baggage along and take some more?
I would say so. Ukraine. So we're bringing some nurses here. That is our first objective right now.
Yes.
Is to get the nurses trained. Ethiopia, we met last week and talked at length about it. And interestingly, quite a few doctors and nurses and mid-levels have expressed interest in helping out with this project, and which I think is fascinating. So we've had some anesthesiologists, neurologists, who else?
Some PAs, I think some of our biplane team for our interventional and endovascular interventionalists are interested. So a big group of people.
And actually occasionally, strangely enough, I get an Ethiopian patient that shows up mostly from Atlanta, strangely. But there's an Ethiopian community there, and there's a Ukrainian one. Have they given you some insights or help, or maybe that's possible?
So this is interesting, and when we met with this pastor of the Ukrainian church, so we're like, if we're gonna, it was literally our first venture out to hopefully help raise funds and to bring, start a dialogue with somebody that maybe they have some homes that can help house these nurses, all these, just to start a conversation. And if you think about it, you have a Ukrainian church, so they have a lot of people from Ukraine and a lot of people still there now.
Yes.
So you think about how much that they're trying to help here in the community right now, and then people back home. So they're really stretched thin. It's almost like,
well, that's a good point.
Yeah, exactly.
Family there, and we're just trying to. My brother-in-law is on the street or whatever. My sister had a terrible injury. I mean, all kinds of things.
They're already giving to all of these causes that are already supporting Ukraine in all these different ways, and it was very eye-opening to realize that even though you went there because you're thinking, well, here's a connection, here's a way for people to help, like they are already doing as much as they can.
It's for the 50 million Ukrainians out there and a large number of people overseas, it's just this awful catastrophe. So we can just look around the world and see catastrophes. The Syrian people just devastated. war in different places. You could say Iran is an issue, Afghanistan, all sorts of things we didn't know nothing about. Well, it's been great having you two here. I want you to keep up the good work. It's been a pleasure to listen to your efforts. And so please come back and talk to us some more. And so good luck to you. Thank you, Lee. That's very nice of you. Thank you. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.